Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hope you're having an amazing day. An absolutely massive update to the specifications of the RTX 5090 and 5080 specs has appeared online. And the fantastic news for both of these cards, the 5090 in particular might I add, well, the specifications have received quite an upgrade versus the slightly older specs. Now I find this particularly curious because the GB202 die, which is going to be found in the 5090, can support a 512-bit bus, but the rumours were that the 5090 was going to cut this down to just 448-bit, but this no longer seems to be the case, and Jensen is going to be blessing us with a fully enabled 512-bit GDDR7 die. Well, there's a lot to talk about here, and I'll get right into it after this quick message from the sponsor of the video. This video is sponsored by SCDKeys.com, but let's check out the Windows and Microsoft offers, starting with this deal for Windows 11. If you were to purchase this from the official Microsoft store, it would cost you $199 US. But you can use SCDKeys.com and you can grab it for just $23.50 using our code RD25. If you prefer to stick with Windows 10, after all you can still upgrade it later on down the line to Windows 11 if you choose, this can be available hugely discounted, and combined with their back to school sale with our code, the price goes down to just $16.80. If you're concerned about the legitimacy of the keys, here you can see us going through the payment process, receiving the code, and of course that all important activation. And obviously this is a private account, they did not set this up for us, we made it ourselves with one of our own private email addresses. Plus, you can use our code RD25 to save that 25% on Microsoft Office codes. So that would make Microsoft Office 2016 available for just $28.60 if you're using our code. But these are just some of the keys available, and there's a huge library of games, Windows and Office codes, as well as much more. You can check the description to head straight to Windows 10, 11 or Office and use our code RD25 to save yourself 25% off of your order. Thanks again to STD Keys for sponsoring the video. So guys, I'm really sorry for not being on camera for this one. This news just popped up pretty much last minute, and I am currently packing to head away to Wales for a couple of days. There will be a couple of videos that I've already recorded that's going to be popping up on the channel the next couple of days, but yeah, I'm basically going to be buggering off to a friend's wedding, for those who don't know. Anyway, with that said, let's get right into this, shall we? So I'll start things out with the 5090, which of course will be the flagship. You can see here that Coppertite 7 Kimi has the specs. We'll go over the specifications and I'll give my thoughts in just a moment, but let's just start out with the specs at large. So the 5090 is PG144/145 SKU30 GB202 300-A1. Now we have 21,760 FP32s, 512-bit GDDR7 32G, and finally 600 watts. Now, some of you may not be super aware what that means, but basically, just to give you a quick overview, this means that we're looking at 170 SMs. This is actually up a tiny bit versus my previous leaks. I was hearing it was like around 160, I've mentioned a couple of times. In fact, I said 160 to 170 was what I was hearing, so 170 does seem to be right. But the very curious thing is 512-bit. Now, myself, Coppertite 7, and many others had at this point said that, again, while the fully enabled GB202 die does fully support 512-bit, this has been well established, it had been cut to only 448-bit. But of course there were multiple configurations, as I've mentioned before, that were being tested, and it seems that Nvidia are once again settling on 512-bit. I find this very interesting, honestly, and I'll be super curious to know the exact reason Nvidia are doing this. Now, unfortunately, what we don't know right now is the amount of cache which is on the GPU. I had some really old info that it was, I think it was 92 megabytes or something like that. That's from memory, that's not from notes, so that's possibly wrong. But roughly around the same amount as what we have with the RTX 40 series. But again, that information is probably not correct because one, it's really old, and two, it's only from a single source, so that's never really, you know, a good a good base point. Like, I at least try to get things from a couple of people. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this thing actually performs. And I do wonder whether this is going to be a reason for memory bandwidth being constrained for this, or whether it was also just to simply, maybe it's a marketing reason. I'm going to be very curious to see how much this thing costs. I frankly expect it to be more expensive than a 4090. I mean, I have not heard prices at this point. Obviously, it's a little early at this stage. I personally, and this is not a leak, I am expecting this thing to cost like, I think the 4090 was $1599, right? So I'm expecting this to be at least another 200 to 300 bucks on top of that. Like, I don't think this thing is going to be cheap. I expect it to be really expensive. It's going to be very curious to see how well it performs. I've also heard some rumors that DLSS 4 is going to be debuting with the 5090 again, and well, should I say the RTX 50 series again. I've only had that from a single source at this point, but they have been fairly accurate in the past, so I'll give them some benefit and just mention it real quick in the video. The other standout here is 600 watts. From my previous videos, I've mentioned that there have been multiple TDPs being tested. We have heard 600 watts before. I've also heard 450, 480, and 550 watts, as again I've mentioned in the video before. However, these are just different configurations that are being tested internally. Whether this is the final spec for this GPU, I'm not too certain. I will be very curious, because if this actually ends up getting released, I'm actually going to be pretty pleasantly surprised. 512-bit is, it's a little higher than I expected. Around 160, 170 SM is not too surprising, but again, the 512-bit bus is pretty nice. What about the 5080, I hear you ask? Well, again, no pricing information, but it is using GB203. This is not too surprising. Again, we've heard this before. 10,752 FP32, 256-bit GDDR7, and 400 watts. Now, I don't need to tell you guys that 400 watts is a lot of juice. Assuming this information is correct and NVIDIA doesn't cut this down, 400 watts is up massively. The 4080, of course, was 320 watts. Oh, I also forgot to mention that the 4090 is 450 watts. However, there are variants of the 4090, of course, that you can get, which are 600 watts supporting. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether the 400 watts is going to be the final configuration for the 5080. 16 gigabytes of RAM. I don't think that's awful, but it's also not great. I would have preferred a slightly wider bus, like, I don't know, 320 would have been nice. To be honest with you, like, I kind of feel like 320-bit would have been really nice. 16 gigabytes for this, again, of course, it will depend somewhat on the pricing of the GPU, but there's quite a gap here, to be very honest with you guys, because the 5080 is 84 SM. So, I mean, I'm just doing a quick math here, but it's roughly half of the SM of the 5090. So that's kind of interesting. This almost certainly tells us that there's going to be a 5080 Ti. I have mentioned before in videos that I've heard a 5080 Ti is going to happen. I did leak some specifications previously that I had heard it's a 256-bit bus for the 5080, and I heard it was around 80 SM. But yeah, I mean, if a 5080 Ti doesn't launch, I will be shocked. I don't necessarily think it's going to launch, however, at the same time of these two cards. So this is going to be very interesting. The 5090 though, and the 5080, now we have some pretty tangible specs. I'm curious though to hear what you think these things are going to cost. I will also be very interested to see how well the 5080 performs against the 4090. You would assume that the 5080 should roughly be on par, perhaps slightly better than the previous flagship. NVIDIA have done this multiple times at this point. You know, the previous generation, it's usually like the 5080, or should I say the 80 class card is usually slightly faster than the previous generation flagship, or it could be the 70 class card is a little bit faster than the previous generation flagship, depending on whether you're talking about rasterization performance or ray tracing or whatever NVIDIA are focusing on that previous generation. Another thing we don't have at this stage are clock frequencies. I have heard that these things do clock over 3 gigahertz, but again, we don't know anything for the final specs right now, so I'll be very interested to see how well these things perform. With that said, guys, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day. Bye for now.